Yo, what's up guys, it's Talon. So the first half of this video is going to be me talking about does draft really matter and what you really should worry about in draft. And then the second half of the video is going to be more of a drafting guide where I explain to you guys the most important parts of draft and the things that you do really need to pay attention to and the things that don't quite matter as much. So the first kind of thing, just talking about if it really does matter or not, I want to mention a few things. First thing is most solo queue games generally get decided more through the early game or through the gameplay, in my opinion. I'll often get annoyed when someone will watch, a game of mine, and then they'll be in my chat, they'll be like trying to tell me what went wrong in the game, and they'll say, yeah, I think you just needed to draft this champion, or if only you didn't have a ranged top laner on your team this game, or whatever other reason that they think. And generally speaking, this kind of annoys me because I don't feel like it's usually really the reason that we lost the game. To me, quite often, it's, if someone loses their lane really hard early and someone gets really fed off that, or someone making a mistake later on in the game that leads to a loss. But to me, most often, the games are decided through the lane phase or through decision-making of other players, rather than necessarily the team composition. The gameplay just overall matters a lot more when deciding the outcome of any individual game. And while draft is something that can be somewhat important, to me, it's much less important than proficiency on your actual champion. Most of the time, if you understand how to play your champion, you know how to play them in many scenarios, including situations where maybe you don't have a tank on your team, or you have a harder matchup, or all of these other things, as I kind of talked about in my one-tricking video. And so generally speaking, to me, draft is not going to overly impact the game. It's very rare that I've ever felt like the draft has really impacted the outcome of the game or been the reason that we lose or win. Now, if you are, say, really good at like 2 or 3 champions, well, then it might not be a bad idea to play the champion that you're best at in a game where, say you have a champion pool of 3 champions and you see that it's a hard matchup for 2 of your champions, but a decent one for the other one, then you would pick that champion, it'll be helpful. Or say that you play, a tank and you also play a squishy champion and your team needs a tank, it's not a bad idea to play that tank in that scenario. So I'm not saying that draft can't help you get an edge, it's just less likely in most scenarios to actually help you get an edge. But now I will talk about some of the most important parts of draft, or the things that matter the most. So the first thing in draft is that you do want to have some type of engaged champion. So that is one thing that typically makes it harder to play the game if you don't have any engage. Now I do have a video on how to play without like frontline or engage or tanks in Wild Rift. So that video does kind of explain how even in that scenario, you can actually get through it perfectly fine if you play properly. But generally speaking, it makes the game a lot more straightforward if you do have some type of an engage. So in terms of draft, I would say the number one thing that you typically want is to have some type of bruiser or tank or frontline that can engage onto the enemy and kind of make the game a bit more straightforward in that regard. But it's not overly important. I still think that, again, the gameplay is a lot more important for that. Additionally, counter picks especially matter in the solo lane. So if you're playing top lane or mid lane, I would recommend trying to have either a champion who just doesn't have any bad matchups, or having a couple champions in the draft may actually matter in terms of the matchups, because some matchups are relatively impossible to play and you do kind of just get destroyed. And so definitely there are scenarios where you could get hard countered in the lane phase, and that would be one of the main times where draft could actually impact the game potentially. But generally speaking, giving up when you see, a bad draft is just pretty troll. Like I even remember a game, or like a set of 2 games that I had on my stream, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, where we had a pretty good draft, but then our Fizz, he completely trolled the game. He was like, I don't know, like 0-10 or something, right? Just, one of these people who kind of runs the game down on purpose. And then we obviously lost, right? And then the game after that, as we're in draft, I get a Morgana top lane, and someone tells me, oh my god, how are you ever going to win this game? You have a Morgana top lane. There's no reason to even play, or whatever. It's something like that. And this Morgana does significantly better in the game and makes the game significantly easier to win than the Fizz mid lane did last game, even though Fizz mid lane is a normal, fine pick, and obviously Morgana top lane is not really an ideal pick. So even with these weird comps, it's like, sure, obviously you'd probably prefer to not have a Morgana top in most of your games, but at the end of the day, if they perform well, as long as you're able to carry the game and they do their job, you're still going to be fine at the end of the day. So it's really not necessary to just give up just because you have a bad team composition. Again, the gameplay and the way the player actually plays generally does matter a lot more. Okay, so now to continue with some of the more draft-based things that do matter and that you should pay attention to, and the just general compositional things that I think matter. So the first thing is that mixed damage types, right? Do you want a mix of AP and AD? Now, a mix of AP and AD is extremely important whenever the enemy have some tanks, because tanks can build a lot of resistances, and therefore if you have only one type of damage, they'll stack that resistance and they'll become nearly unkillable. So anytime that the enemy has tanks, say they have a Malphite, for example, Thresh, you really can't be building, you know, these or having these full AD comps. You need to have some type of AP in your composition, or if they really just have any tank in your full AP or full AD, it's going to be really hard to play. Additionally, it's a lot better to have a full AD comp than a full AP comp, because full AD comps at least have consistent damage throughout, because they're constantly auto-attacking. A lot of their damage comes from autos, whereas AP champs are only based around their burst damage from their abilities. And so if you are countering their AP with MR, it's going to be very, very hard to play. So generally speaking, if you're going to have only one damage type, you'd rather have AD, but you do want mixed damage, especially into tanks. After that, poke champions and poke compositions are going to be a lot better when the enemy do not have healing. The reason for that is because if you poke someone, but then a Soraka just heals it up, well, now it's basically useless, right? And so poke compositions will work a lot better when enemy have low champs with low vampirism as well, and just not many ways to heal the poke that you do, so that that poke does become permanent on the enemy and they have to recall once you poke them out enough. After that, you can want to generally go less frontline into true damage and tank killers. So if the enemy lock in a Vayne, for example, you're not going to want to start locking in, you know, a Mundo right after you see that. Or if the enemy have a lot of champs who are really good at building like things like Blade of the Rune King and Black Cleaver and other items that make it really hard for your champion or your tank champions to really survive, you're generally not going to want to do that. But especially true damage is the main thing to look out for when determining whether or not you do want additional tanks. Again, generally speaking, it's nice to have one tank or one frontline for the engage opportunities, but you don't want to have too many. Alongside that, picking tanks is quite good when the enemy have low damage, because if they have low damage or they're squishy and they just don't have many ways to really deal a lot of damage to you, it's going to be quite nice because you're just going to be super tanky. They're going to be not really able to do much. So for example, say the enemy team comp is a lot of poke champs who don't have very like good sustained damage and just don't have much damage to really burst you down, then tank champs are going to be very good. So tank champs are kind of going to be good into burst champs and champs with low sustained damage, but not as good into tank killers with a lot of sustained damage like Vayne or Camille, for example. And then if you're a shield heavy champ, like say Set or Lux, for example, you're going to want to pick these more commonly if the enemy don't have great anti-shield builders. So obviously any AP champ can kind of build anti-shield, but they're less commonly going to do so than AD champs, where AD champs that can build Serpent's Fang, so a lot of armor penetration and ability-based damaging champs, like a lot of lethality assassins, for example, like Talon and Zed, they're going to build anti-shielding. But certain junglers like Vi, for example, doesn't love building it. Now, Vi can still build it, but she prefers not to, and so you would rather pick these heavier shield champs into champs who can't build as much shielding. Again, this is not something I'd necessarily considered that heavily, but it's something to keep in mind if you're looking for, like, you know, more draft tips. Obviously, I'm just giving a lot of draft tips at the end of this video, even ones that I don't think are necessarily overly important, but a lot of these other tips are quite important if you're looking to get a little bit of an edge in draft. But generally speaking, those are going to be some of the main differences in terms of drafting and kind of times that you're going to want to draft certain team comps and certain types of champions. The last one would be that you want to draft assassins, obviously, into a lot of squishy champs, and you're not going to want to pick them as much into really tanky comps because it's going to be really hard to really do anything. So overall, those are going to be like some of the most important things for drafting. To just reiterate really quickly, mixed damage types matter more into tanks. Poke champs are better when they have no healing. You want to pick less frontline into true damage. If you're picking a shield heavy champ, you don't want to pick it into champs who can build a lot of anti-shielding, and you want to pick assassins and do a lot of squishy champions. So overall, that's going to kind of do it for the video. I hope that it was important and helpful for you guys in terms of understanding that draft doesn't necessarily matter too much in most games, but these are some of the biggest things for drafting if you are looking to gain an advantage in draft. As always, you know, make sure you like and subscribe. I do coaching for $15 an hour as a rank 5 sovereign autofill player. I feel like it can be pretty helpful for you guys, so if you're interested in that, DM me on Discord, Talon1169, or through the link in the description, and I'll see you guys in the next video.